Okay. Next up is our keynote speaker, John M. Samuels, who is Senior Managing Director and Chairman of Global Tax of Blackstone. John.
So thank you very much, Larry. So Larry asked me to introduce myself. I guess it's late in the day, and whoever was going to introduce me is tired. I am John Samuels. I am the head of tax at Blackstone. I'm relatively new to Blackstone, but I'm not new to tax. I was the head of tax at GE for close to 28 years, and before that, practiced tax law in Washington. In addition to being the head of tax at Blackstone, I chair a group called the International Tax Policy Forum in Washington. I co-chair a group called the Alliance for Competitive Taxation, or ACT, in Washington. And I teach international tax at Yale Law School. So what I want to say at the outset is everything I say today has nothing to do with any of those institutions. It's all remarks are solely mine and solely attributable to me. So thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. I think the title of this year's symposium is extremely well chosen. The changes in the international tax rules that we've experienced in the last several years have certainly been reminiscent of a roller coaster ride with its sudden twists and turns and precipitous ups and downs. And like being on a roller coaster, at times these changes have made you want to close your eyes and scream out loud. And for better or for worse, I think the ride is just beginning. Indeed, it seems the only thing constant in the international tax world these days is change. Now, I want to talk today about why it's important for the United States to have a competitive international tax system, where our current system falls short even after tax reform, and finally, what we might be able to do to make things better in the future. Now, to provide a framework for thinking about our international tax system, I want to start by considering first principles and asking two fundamental questions. First, what is the primary purpose of a country's tax system? And second, why should a country care about having a competitive international tax system? Let's take the first question first. What is the primary purpose of a country's tax system? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. The primary purpose of a country's tax system is to pay for the functions of government, namely to provide the government with the funds that it needs to protect the safety, security, and freedom of its citizens and residents, and to advance and promote their social and economic welfare. So like it or not, taxes are a fact of life. They're a necessary evil. We need them to pay for our government. But the decisions that a country makes in designing its tax system are also of paramount importance to the country's economic welfare. And that's because, while necessary, another reality is that taxes are harmful to a country's economy. And virtually all economists agree that taxes do economic harm in two ways. First, taxes slow economic growth by taking capital from the private sector that otherwise could be invested in productive activities. This is what economists call the direct burden of taxes. However, because a fixed amount of revenue must be raised to pay for the necessary functions of government, little can be done to mitigate the harm this so-called direct burden of taxes imposes on a country's economy, other than to argue about the appropriate size of government, which is a question of politics, not tax policy. And of course, the direct burden of taxes on a country's economy is offset by the value of the benefits and services provided by the government to its citizens and residents. But economists also universally agree that taxes do economic harm in a second way, and that's by inducing people and businesses to change their behavior in response to the very existence of taxes. Economists call the economic harm resulting from these tax-induced changes in behavior the indirect burden or the excess burden that taxes impose on a country's economy. For example, if the tax rate on wages becomes too high, say 90%, people might change their behavior and stay home instead of working. Now, this behavioral response to taxes would be a labor-leisure trade-off that would clearly be harmful to a country's economy. So the primary goal of a country's tax system is to raise revenue to pay for the cost of government, but to design that tax system so that it doesn't encourage taxpayers to change their behavior in ways that could be harmful to the country's economy. So now let's turn to the second foundational question. Why should a country care about having a competitive international tax system? What exactly is the ultimate goal of an internationally competitive tax system? And again, I think the answer to that question is pretty clear. The goal of an internationally competitive tax system should be to improve the standard of living of a country's citizens and residents, to increase their productivity and economic well-being so they can consume more goods and services and enjoy more leisure time. And increasing economic welfare includes providing good, high-paying jobs that will give people a sense of purpose and allow them to experience the dignity of work. So how can a country's international tax system improve the standard of living of its people? Again, I think the answer to this question is straightforward. A competitive international tax system can improve a country's standard of living by encouraging both domestic and foreign companies to invest capital, perform R&D, create jobs, and locate their headquarters within the country's borders. Now, further, a competitive international tax system should allow domestic companies to compete and win in foreign markets. Because when domestic companies succeed in foreign markets, it improves the standard of living in their home countries by creating jobs and increasing wages for their employees and suppliers at home. Simply put, the more successful a U.S. company is abroad, the more jobs it creates at home. And when U.S. companies win in foreign markets, their shareholders also win, which also increases the standard of living in the United States. And that's because, as a result of the so-called home country bias, most of the stock in U.S. companies is owned by U.S. citizens and residents. So when U.S. companies win in foreign markets, the wealth effect from their rising stock prices largely accrues to Americans, increasing their wealth and enhancing their standard of living. So let's get to the real question. If the primary purpose of the U.S. tax system is to raise revenue to pay for our government, the real question, and it's a seminal question, is whether the United States can raise meaningful revenue by taxing the international operations of U.S. companies and still have an internationally competitive tax system that advances the standard of living in America. In other words, is there a conflict between these two goals? And if so, how should it be resolved? And here's the rub. In today's globally integrated economy, as both economic theory would predict and abundant evidence has shown, as long as the U.S. tax system is out of line with the rest of the world, it is virtually impossible for the United States to raise significant revenue from taxing the overseas operations of U.S. companies without encouraging those companies to move headquarters, jobs, and operations out of the United States to countries where their overseas income will be subject to a lower tax burden. And driving corporate headquarters, capital, and jobs out of the United States can result in serious and lasting harm to our economy that is far greater than the benefit of any short-term revenue gain from taxing these international operations. And these kinds of tax-induced behavioral changes are far more than a theoretical concern. In fact, we have a perfect real-world example. The repeal of deferral for the U.S. shipping companies in 1986 provides us with a perfect real-world example of a tax-induced change in behavior that was so damaging to the U.S. economy that Congress was forced to reverse its action and restore deferral for U.S. shippers, but not before real damage was done to the U.S. economy. Now, in 1986, as is the case today, no country in the world imposed tax on the overseas income of shipping companies. So because shipping income of U.S. companies was not taxed by foreign countries, Congress decided in 1986 to repeal deferral and subject the worldwide income of U.S. shipping companies to current U.S. tax. As a result, U.S. shipping companies were faced with paying current U.S. tax on their worldwide income when the worldwide income of their foreign competitors was tax-free. And in very short order, the U.S. shipping industry was decimated. U.S. shippers rapidly lost market share, and U.S. shipping companies were quickly acquired by foreign companies who did not pay any tax on their overseas income. In a 2-year period, U.S.-owned ships fell by 40%, and the U.S. Share of the world's merchant fleet dropped by more than 90%, resulting in a loss of over 40,000 jobs in the U.S. shipping industry in a few short years. And the precipitous decline in the U.S. shipping industry also had implications for our national security. And that's because by 2002, we didn't have a sufficient number of U.S.-owned ships that could be requisitioned by the military to help defend our country in the event of a war or a national emergency. So to reverse the economic and strategic damage that it had caused by repealing deferral, Congress restored deferral for U.S. shipping companies in 2004 to put them back on a level playing field with their foreign competitors. Now, the shipping example is a perfect case study showing that as long as the U.S. tax system is out of line with the rest of the world, we can't expect to raise taxes on the international operations of U.S. companies without having them move their headquarters, jobs, and investments overseas to countries that will impose a lower burden on their global income. Indeed, in hindsight, it appears that the response of U.S. shippers to the repeal of deferral may have been the canary in the coal mine. And that's because for the next 30-plus years, U.S. companies steadily moved assets, headquarters, and jobs out of the United States in response to the heavy tax burden the U.S. tax system imposed on their international operations. Now, these were movements of real economic activities that harmed the domestic economy and U.S. living standards, and that began as a trickle and over time grew into a torrent. Now, one of the principal reasons for the accelerating exodus of corporate headquarters, investment, and jobs from the U.S. has been the globalization of the U.S. economy. Simply put, as U.S. companies began to compete in global markets against foreign companies who faced far lower tax burdens, U.S. companies were forced to find ways to reduce their taxes to be competitive. Simply put, necessity became the mother of invention. And not surprisingly, U.S. companies and their advisors came up with a host of creative ways to reduce the U.S. tax burden on their global income. Now, the most direct way for a U.S. company to escape the worldwide U.S. tax net was to move its headquarters abroad in a so-called corporate inversion. At first, these tax-motivated transactions were nothing more than simple reincorporations or F-reorganizations, where a U.S. company would merge into a newly formed shell company in a low-tax country like Bermuda, with the U.S. company's former shareholders owning 100% of the stock of the new foreign company. However, in response to a series of high-profile inversions, in 2004, Congress stopped these transactions by enacting Section 7874 that treated the surviving foreign entity in these naked reincorporations as a U.S. corporation for tax purposes. But Congress recognized that it would not be appropriate to throw a roadblock in front of legitimate cross-border mergers. So as long as the foreign company was a real company, which was defined as one whose value was at least 25% of the U.S. company's value, the foreign survivor in a cross-border merger would continue to be treated as a foreign corporation for U.S. tax purposes. So not surprisingly, U.S. companies next began to seek out foreign merger partners who were at least 25% their size. And after a brief pause, cross-border mergers in which U.S. companies moved their headquarters abroad continued unabated. Between 2004 and 2016, more than 50 major U.S. companies moved their headquarters out of the United States by merging with foreign corporations in low-tax countries. And U.S. companies who didn't invert or who couldn't invert found other ways to reduce U.S. taxes on their worldwide income, including by transferring assets and businesses to wholly owned affiliates in low-tax countries like Ireland. And not surprisingly, high on the list of assets transferred to these low-tax affiliates were patents, copyrights, know-how, and other valuable intangible assets. Because transferring these valuable intangible assets to low-tax countries could generate enormous tax savings. And these large tax savings made the cost-benefit analysis of these transfers compelling, because the non-tax costs of moving intangible assets like patents out of the United States are negligible. Indeed, in most cases, only legal and appraisal fees. And of course, when intangible assets are transferred to a low-tax country, the U.S. loses the tax revenue it would have collected if the intangible assets had been owned in the United States, which has led many to believe that the principal policy problem presented when U.S. companies transfer valuable intangible assets to tax havens is a loss of U.S. tax revenue. But the policy problem presented by this tax-induced migration of valuable IP from the United States is far greater than simply a problem of lost revenue, something that is little understood by policymakers. And that's because once a U.S. company owns a patent or other valuable IP in a low-tax country, the manufacturing or production processes that scale that IP can be conducted anywhere in the world except one place, and that is the United States. Consider a U.S. company that has transferred a valuable patent to its wholly owned Irish subsidiary, and the patent protects the right to manufacture a high-tech product. The Irish affiliate that owns the patent can manufacture the product in Ireland, or it can license the patent to a third-party contract manufacturer in Taiwan, Vietnam, or China, or anywhere else in the world. But the one thing the Irish subsidiary can't do without defeating the scheme to shield the profits attributable to the patent from the Irish patent from U.S. tax is to license the patent to a related manufacturer in the United States. And that's because the royalty payments received by the Irish subsidiary from the U.S. manufacturer would be Subpart F income that would be subject to full U.S. tax and defeat the scheme of transferring the patent to Ireland. Similarly, the Irish subsidiary couldn't enter into a contract manufacturing arrangement with a manufacturer in the United States without running the unacceptable risk that the Irish subsidiary would have a permanent establishment in the United States, a result that would also subject the Irish subsidiary's profits attributable to the patent to full U.S. tax. Now, a report put out by the National Science Board in 2012 showed that the number of high-tech manufacturing jobs in the United States declined by 687,000, or 28%, between 2000 and 2010, a far greater decline in manufacturing jobs than in any other sector of our economy. And while we can't conclusively prove the U.S. tax system is the reason we lost these high-tech manufacturing jobs, it is certainly a smoking gun. Now, another important factor contributing to the exodus of corporate headquarters and capital from the United States over the last several decades is the fact that while the U.S. has stubbornly clung to a worldwide tax system with the highest corporate rate in the world, virtually every other developed country in the world was reforming its tax system with the goal of attracting corporate headquarters, investment, and jobs to their shores. For example, the United Kingdom recently adopted a territorial system, reduced its corporate rate to 19%, with a further reduction to 17% next year, and adopted a patent box regime that taxes patent-related income at a rate of only 10%. And the UK government was unabashedly explicit in explaining why it was making these changes to its corporate tax system. In announcing these tax changes, the UK government said, and here I quote, "The government wants to send out the signal loud and clear that Britain is open for business. Let it be heard around the world, from Shanghai to Seattle and from Stuttgart to Sao Paulo. Britain is open for business." Now, the UK is only one of the latest in a long list of countries that have reduced their corporate tax rates and adopted territorial tax systems. And that's because these countries understand that in today's integrated global economy, attempting to raise revenue by taxing the highly mobile international operations of their companies is not only a fool's errand, but is likely to be counterproductive by driving headquarters, investment, and jobs from their countries to foreign shores. Now, some might refer to this global tax competition for investment and jobs as a race to the bottom, which I guess it is if you define the goal of the race as being how much tax revenue a country can collect from taxing highly mobile, highly profitable capital at the corporate or entity level. But what if a country's goal in this race is not to raise as much revenue as possible from attempting to tax internationally mobile capital, that today flows across national borders like liquid mercury in search of the highest after-tax returns, an effort to raise revenue that may be a fool's errand in today's global economy? What if instead a country's goal is to use its tax system to attract and retain capital investment and corporate headquarters that will generate high-paying jobs and increase the standard of living of its citizens and residents? Then maybe tax competition is not a race to the bottom at all. Maybe it's a race to the top. But whatever you think about this race, whether you like it or not, the fact is this race is a reality in today's competitive global economy, and there are no signs it is slowing down. So the good news is that in 2017, the U.S. finally woke up to the fact that its outmoded tax system was driving corporate headquarters, capital, and jobs from the United States, and adopted a sweeping reform of our international tax system. Now, one of the principal purposes of U.S. tax reform was, in the words of the Senate Finance Committee, and again, here I quote, to allow U.S. companies to compete on a more level playing field against foreign multinationals, and to eliminate the features of our old tax system that encouraged U.S. companies to move their headquarters abroad and shift income to low-tax jurisdictions. So Congress clearly recognized that our old tax system was broken and wanted to provide a level playing field that would allow U.S. companies to compete under the same rules as their foreign competitors. So how did we do? Was Congress successful in providing a level playing field for U.S. companies that eliminated the tax incentives they had under prior law to move their headquarters abroad and to shift income and investments out of the United States? At first blush, it appears Congress might have achieved its intended purpose. Tax reform lowered the corporate rate to 21%, which when combined with the average 6% state and local corporate rate paid by U.S. companies, puts the combined after-tax federal and state corporate rate at about 25.7%. The U.S. also adopted a dividend exemption system like other OECD countries that allows U.S. companies to repatriate their foreign earnings without having to pay any U.S. tax on those foreign dividends. And that thereby eliminated the lockout effect of prior law that resulted in U.S. companies stockpiling trillions of dollars of earnings offshore and borrowing at home to meet their domestic cash needs. Now, if Congress had stopped with these two changes, we would have clearly had a competitive international tax system that was aligned with the rest of the world. We would have had a competitive corporate rate and a territorial system like other countries. But unfortunately, Congress didn't stop with these two changes and also adopted several new and unprecedented provisions like GILTI and the BEAT that impose U.S. tax on the global operation of U.S. companies. And these new and unique provisions don't have counterparts in any other country in the world. So once again, the U.S. tax system is out of line with international norms, and U.S. companies aren't on a level playing field. So why did Congress do this? Why impose new taxes on U.S. companies that will impair their international competitiveness and continue to incent them to move headquarters and investment abroad? Now, the answer to this question is a single word: revenue. Congress enacted these new and unprecedented provisions to raise revenue. But even more disappointingly, these new provisions were not adopted simply to raise revenue to ensure the overall cost of tax reform didn't exceed the $1.5 trillion limit on revenue losses from tax reform that was established by Congress as part of the budget reconciliation process. Instead, these provisions were adopted to satisfy a second revenue constraint imposed on the tax reform process that was little understood or appreciated outside the Beltway, namely that changes to the international tax system had to be revenue neutral within themselves, which meant that any change to the international tax system that lost revenue had to be offset by another change to the international tax system that raised revenue. Now, the practical effect of this second revenue constraint was that the $224 billion revenue loss that the Joint Committee on Taxation assigned to the new dividend exemption system had to be paid for with new international provisions like GILTI that raised $112 billion, and the BEAT, which raised $149.6 billion in the 10-year budget window. And unlike the overall revenue constraint imposed on tax reform by the budget reconciliation process, the requirement that changes to the international tax system had to be revenue neutral within themselves was not required by law, but instead was entirely self-imposed by Congress to address a political concern. Apparently, some members of Congress and their staffs did not want it to appear as if they were giving tax relief to multinational corporations that was being paid for by purely domestic companies. Now, this political concern raises a number of troubling questions, including how do you decide if the revenue gain or loss from a particular tax change should be ascribed to a multinational or a purely domestic company? And more fundamentally, what's the policy rationale for requiring tax changes affecting multinationals to be revenue neutral while providing tax cuts to purely domestic companies, especially when, unlike multinationals, domestic companies generally compete on a level tax playing field? But the irony is, the ultimate irony is, by insisting that all changes to the international tax system had to be revenue neutral, Congress put itself in a self-imposed straitjacket that required it to adopt provisions like GILTI and the BEAT that directly undercut tax reform's goal of establishing a level playing field for U.S. companies. Now let's take a brief look at one of these new international revenue-raising provisions, the new minimum tax on global intangible low-taxed income, or GILTI, that imposes current U.S. tax on the active foreign business income of U.S. companies, whether or not that income is repatriated. Now, Congress enacted GILTI to ensure U.S. companies pay a minimum rate of tax on their foreign intangible income to prevent them from shifting intangible assets to low-tax countries. Now, one instructive thing to note about this new tax is its rate. Congress set the GILTI minimum tax rate at 10.5%, or half the 21% U.S. corporate rate, for the express purpose, and this is clear in the legislative history, for the express purpose of mitigating the competitive disadvantage this new minimum tax would impose on U.S. companies whose foreign competitors don't face comparable minimum taxes in their home countries. So the lower rate on GILTI shows Congress clearly understood other countries don't impose current taxes on the active foreign income of their companies, and that by adopting GILTI, it would be putting U.S. companies at a competitive disadvantage in global markets. And the early indications are that this new minimum tax on GILTI has some real and unexpected teeth. A recent survey of 40 major U.S. multinational companies across a wide range of industries found that after tax reform, more than 83% of the foreign income of these companies was subject to current U.S. tax. 74.8% of it was subject to current U.S. tax under GILTI, and 8.7% under Subpart F. So with more than 80% of the foreign income of U.S. companies now subject to current U.S. tax, maybe the best way to think about our new international tax system is that we've effectively repealed deferral, albeit at a 10.5% rate. But in this regard, it's worth noting that the GILTI rate automatically increases to 13.125% in 2026, and that Democratic senators are already calling for the GILTI rate to be increased from 10.5% to the full 21% corporate rate. Now, the recent survey of the 40 U.S. major multinationals also found that GILTI was not limited to U.S. companies whose foreign income was subject to low foreign tax rates. As a result of proposed Treasury regulations that would extend the prior law expense allocation rules to GILTI, companies paying foreign tax rates that are even higher than the 21% U.S. corporate rate are still subject to GILTI, a result that is hard to believe was intended by Congress, given that the purpose of GILTI was to prevent U.S. companies from transferring intangible assets to low-tax countries, and also hard to reconcile with the fact that Congress used the words low-taxed in describing the kind of income that it wanted to subject to the new GILTI minimum tax. And there's one further point to note about GILTI. By setting the rate at 10.5%, Congress may have undercut the very purpose of enacting GILTI, namely to eliminate the tax incentive U.S. companies have to transfer patents and other valuable intangible assets to low-tax countries. And that's because if a U.S. company owns a patent in the United States, it will have to pay the full 21% U.S. corporate rate on the worldwide income from that patent. But if it transfers the patent to a country with a tax rate of 13.125%, it will not have to pay any U.S. tax on the patent income. And this almost 8 percentage point differential between 21% and 13.125% in tax rates will make transferring the patent to the low-tax country a no-brainer in many cases, especially given the negligible non-tax cost of transferring patents abroad. And again, unfortunately, once the patent is owned abroad, the manufacturing operations to scale that patent can be located anywhere in the world, but not in the United States. And the new FDII provision that provides a lower 13.125% rate on income from intangibles owned in the United States is not likely to change this result, since that low rate, the FDII rate, only applies to exports and not to income earned from goods or services sold for use or consumption in the United States. Simply put, GILTI is a halfway house that is both too broad and too narrow at the same time. It's too broad because it hits U.S. companies whose operations are outside the United States for reasons that have nothing to do with saving taxes. And it's too narrow because it's not likely to stop the transfer of valuable and tangible assets to low-tax countries. Now, Congress fully understood that provisions like GILTI would create new tax incentives for companies to move their headquarters abroad. So to prevent the loss of corporate headquarters because of these new provisions, Congress substantially toughened up the anti-inversion rules of Section 7874, including by providing dividends paid by newly inverted companies would not be eligible for the 20%, would not be qualified dividends eligible for the 20% rate. That the transition tax imposed under Section 965 on the historic earnings of a newly inverted country would be retroactively imposed at the full 35% U.S. corporate rate without any foreign tax credits, and that a newly inverted company will not be eligible for the cost of goods sold exception for base erosion payments under the BEAT. Now, these are obviously extraordinarily punitive provisions. Indeed, anyone who advises a client to engage in an inversion transaction today will almost certainly be guilty of tax malpractice. But the fact of the matter is these tough new anti-inversion penalties are not likely to be very effective in preventing the loss of U.S. headquarters or the continuing flow of investment and jobs abroad. And that's because of a simple, basic, and undeniable economic truth. In today's global economy, one way or another, income-producing assets will ultimately end up being owned by companies in whose hands they will produce the highest after-tax rate of return. For example, U.S. companies will be able to avoid these tough new anti-inversion penalties by splitting off their foreign operations into smaller bite-sized pieces that can be acquired by foreign corporations in transactions that will not technically be inversions because the former U.S. company's shareholders will own less than 60% of the surviving company. And inversions, of course, are only one way, albeit a highly visible one, in which the foreign operations of U.S. companies can end up being owned by foreign companies in whose hands they'll produce higher after-tax rates of return. For example, the tough new anti-inversion rules won't prevent U.S. companies from directly selling their foreign operations to foreign buyers in whose hands they would produce higher after-tax returns because they wouldn't be subject to a GILTI-like minimum tax once they were owned by the foreign buyer. Nor would the tough anti-inversion rules prevent new companies from starting up outside the United States to avoid having the income from their international operations subject to the new GILTI minimum tax. The bottom line is that in today's open global economy, attempts to use our tax system to wall capital and corporate headquarters into the United States when other countries are reducing the tax burden on international business income are no more likely to be successful than King Canute's efforts to hold back the tide, or the Berlin Wall to restrain the spread of democracy. Looking back, it seems we haven't learned our lesson from the damage done to the U.S. economy when Congress repealed deferral for the shipping industry in 1986, which brings to mind the famous quote from the philosopher George Santayana: "Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it." Maybe that's our destiny. I hope not, but maybe it is. Now, some might ask, and I think the panel before me focused on this, say, I understand our new tax system isn't perfect, but at least aren't we better off than we were before? I'm not sure how to answer that question. The lower corporate rate and the elimination of the lockout effect under our old worldwide system are definite improvements. But the incentives on the margin to move corporate headquarters to countries like the UK with business-friendly tax regimes and to move valuable IP to low-tax countries like Ireland may be just as strong or even stronger today. And more importantly, I'm not sure if asking whether we're better off today than we were before is even the right question. Because decisions like where to locate the headquarters of a surviving company in a cross-border merger, or where to start up a new company, or whether valuable intangible assets should be owned in the US or in Ireland, are all binary in nature. It's either here or there. There is no middle ground. In a sense, it's like being a mile out to sea and attempting to swim to shore. You can get 90% of the way there and still drowned in 6 feet of water. Getting close simply isn't good enough. And while it's still too soon to tell how our new tax system, with its unique provisions like GILTI and the BEAT, are going to affect the behavior of US companies, early indications are not promising. As you may have seen, Dana Inc., an Ohio-based auto supplier, announced a merger early last year with GKN, a UK company that would have created the world's largest supplier of axles and automotive drive systems. Now, Dana's shareholders, the US company, would have ended up owning 53% of the combined company, so the transaction would not technically have been an inversion. But even after tax reform, the surviving company was going to be headquartered in the UK, because to quote Dana's CFO, and I'm quoting him now, even with the new tax legislation, there's a tax benefit to us to the tune of $600 million from being headquartered in the UK. Now, is Dana an outlier? Maybe, but I doubt it. But the good news is there's likely to be an opportunity to address the new discontinuities between the US tax system and the rest of the world, because more change is almost certainly on the way. The US tax system today is far from being stable. It's not politically stable because it didn't receive a single Democratic vote in either the House or the Senate. And it's not fiscally stable either, because continuing the tax relief that was provided by tax reform that automatically expires in 2026 means we're going to be facing a fiscal cliff of more than $3.9 trillion in 2026, which is going to force Congress's hand. And change will also be coming from outside the United States, because countries around the world are now pushing for fundamental changes in the basic architecture of the international tax regime to respond to the digital economy. They want to change rules that were established by the League of Nations almost 100 years ago, and it served us reasonably well. So as you can see, the roller coaster ride is far from being over. In fact, it may just be beginning, and with some very big and unpredictable twists and turns ahead of us. So my advice to you is to keep your seatbelts fastened and to hold on tight. So thank you.
Thank you, John. We could have used you during the debate session. I think it would have swayed the votes. Would anyone like to ask John a question while he's still on the stage?
On what? Well, I have not studied it, but I don't think it's well advised. Basically, the proposal is to impose, I think, a surcharge on the financial book income of U.S. companies. And I think it's added to the regular tax, as I understand it. The problem with using financial statement income as the base for our tax system is, I think, twofold. One, as everybody I think knows, financial statement income doesn't reflect accelerated depreciation or expensing, so it would be directly running counter to the incentive Congress wanted to establish by allowing expensing of capital equipment. And secondly, financial statement income includes the worldwide income of a U.S. company. And we just tried to adopt a half-hearted territorial system to exempt that income, now to impose a tax, another tax on it, certainly inconsistent with what Congress just did in 2017. If we were to do something like that, Katie barred the door for U.S. companies trying to get out of this country. Foreign assets owned by would be transferred into foreign hands. I mean, if I have one message, one overarching message, is that the U.S. cannot set our tax policy or our tax rules in a vacuum. We just can't. We have to take into account what other countries in the world are doing. There was a day when we could. There was a day back in the 60s when we had all the capital in the world and we weren't competing with foreign companies, that we could get away with it. That day is long gone. Yeah.
Are you aware of any serious proposals that will be taken up by the Congress that could address all the points that we...
So the answer is I am aware of serious proposals that I think could address these points. And they were taken up by and what they are, I think at the end of the day, the only solution to this morass is to get away from the corporate income tax and move to something called a destination-based tax or a destination-based cash flow tax, something like a VAT, but not quite a VAT. Congress actually took that up. The House Republicans had a plan called the Better Way, a border adjustable tax that would have ineffectively taxed all imports and exempted all exports. And so it wouldn't matter where the factors of production were located. That proposal was politically killed, but it was probably would have been great for the United States. Because the one thing we have left in this global economy is our big domestic market. But a tax system that imposes tax where goods are sold and consumed, and one that exempts exports. And indeed, we're morphing that way. What you're seeing in the digital economy, all these taxes that started with India with a Vodafone case, and the countries with large markets want to tax markets. But France, with its tax on digital income, that's a version of a destination-based tax, where the market is. The UK's idea of taxing digital companies when the user is based in the UK is a form of what I call market-based tax, where the market is. Look, I've practiced tax law for the better part of my life, I'm embarrassed to say, and I could move many things. I could move the factors of production. I could move where patents were located or where debt was incurred or where factories were put to reduce taxes. I could actually move where companies were incorporated and reduce taxes. The one thing I could not move is where the customer is. I can't move where the customer is. And what economists will tell you is if there's an immobile factor, try to tax that. It goes back to what I said at the beginning, fewer distortions. Marty.
John, could you explain the $3.9 trillion fiscal cliff?
Well, that's if Congress wants to extend. So to make tax reform work, it had to be done as part of the budget reconciliation process, which meant it couldn't lose more than $1.5 trillion in the 10-year budget window. Well, Congress couldn't make it all fit, and they couldn't lose revenue in the out years beyond the 10-year budget window. So they put in automatic sunsets of a number of tax provisions. So, for example, the individual tax cuts, everybody who is enjoying a reduced individual tax cut, that rate automatically goes up to the top rate from 37 to 39.6, and the middle income rates automatically goes up in 2026, I think. Now, the reason the Congress did that for individual rates and not corporate rates is they thought they were almost certain Congress would, as a political matter, have to extend those individual cuts. And they were afraid that if they had made the corporate rate sunset, that Congress might not do it, and companies might not count on it, on keeping the low rate beyond 10 years. So, and then other things like the GILTI rate go up, the FDI rate goes down, benefit. In 2026, if Congress just were going to say we want to extend the tax relief we provided in 2017 for another 10 years, that would cost $3.9 trillion. So the clock is ticking. And I know there are those who think we can, what's 3.9 trillion? What is it, modern monetary policy? We shouldn't worry about deficits, but I'm not sure the country's ready for that quite yet.
Okay,
Good, thank you.
John, thank you very much.